The McCartney Alphabet, an A to Z guide to the solo career of Sir Paul McCartney. Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the McCartney Alphabet. I'm David F. Grave. Gap for Clary. There is no Clary. Clary is missing in action. Hence the reason this is another bonus episode and not a proper one, because it's only a proper one if there's two of us here. And the reason this episode is being recorded is because yesterday I went to a listening party for the new McCartney album, The Boys of Dungeon Lane, which comes out at the end of the week that I'm recording. And that was essentially a chance to listen to the album in the wild once, albeit just the once, a full 3 days before it's released officially. And so as a result, I thought I'd just give you my first thoughts having listened to that album. Now, caveats, as I say, I've only listened to it the once. And also I was listening to it on what was so far the hottest day of the year. I'm in the UK here, as you probably know, and it was 32 degrees centigrade that day, in so much that I considered not going to this listening party because I knew it was going to be unbearable on public transport and the like. But then I thought, you know what, sod it. So I booked an Uber, other ride options are available, and went to listen to it. And also, as I say, it's the first listen, so there's only so much you can take in. I did write notes while I was there, but my handwriting is worse than a GP's, so good luck reading that. But yeah, so as I say, I just thought I'd give you my first thoughts on the album, and then obviously eventually Clary and I will look at it properly in a few weeks' time when things have settled and you've got more familiar with the album. So, shuffle of paper, here we go. Now, my first reaction, my initial thoughts, just to sort of sum up, was that it was a lot more intricate and more inventive an album than I was expecting. It's had very, very good reviews. So far, it has an 88 out of 100 Metacritic rating. But McCartney's quite lucky in that very recently his albums have all got very good reviews pretty much across the board. If you look at the last few, Egypt Station, McCartney 3, New, not in that order, and now The Boys of Dungeon Lane, they've all scored very, very highly. Not in every press, but in most. So I think there has been, compared to, say, if you look at the early 70s, a bit of a rethink about him as a recording artist, as a solo artist. And maybe some of that's to do with the work, which, you know, obviously Clary and I think is very good. But maybe some of it is also to do with his sort of elder statesman status now. And that could be some of the reason why. Although I would say that all those albums were pretty good. But yeah, despite that, I found that the songwriting was a lot more sort of intricate. There were a lot more time changes than I was expecting within songs. And I don't know why I don't expect that, because obviously Macca's very known for the sort of mini suite of songs, the Band on the Runs, the Abbey Road medley, that sort of thing, the end of Egypt Station. So it's not like he hasn't done this before, but it did surprise me. Also, my first thought is that a lot of it does sound like it was written in the studio. Not all of it, but a lot of it has that sort of sense of being built out of the sort of recording process that he was doing with the producer, Andrew Watt. Now, obviously, I find that like with things that have been written in the studio, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Some good examples in recent years, I would say, just off the top of my head, are things like Queenie Eye or Deep, Deep Feeling, or the entire Electric Arguments album, which of course was entirely improvised in the studio. But obviously that sort of sense of writing in the studio got a bit of a bad press, I think, particularly in the 80s. But yeah, that's not to say all of the songs are like that. There are certain definite songs on there that very much feel like a song that was written on a piano or acoustic guitar, but there was that sort of sense. I also found, which again shouldn't really be a surprise, but he's really leaning very, very heavily on the one-man band thing. It certainly sounds like the majority of it is just him and that sound that he creates on his own. Obviously, we've got guest appearances from Ringo and the like, and I believe Andrew Watt plays on it as well. But it had that, you know, in many ways, it was leaning a bit more heavily perhaps to the McCartney 3 feel, which was obviously very much like that, the recorded in lockdown thing. But it felt like a sort of slightly livelier version of that, I'd say. But yeah, very much the sense of it being mostly him. And that is often a good sign, I think, of, or a sign of a good McCartney project. Also, as this sort of overarching thought, I did feel that none of the album dragged. The album runs apparently just over 47 minutes, which is a full 10 minutes shorter than Egypt Station, for example. But about the same sort of length as McCartney 3, which was, in fact, that was slightly shorter, 44 minutes, which I would say it probably felt a bit shorter. But one thing McCartney can be guilty of, as we know, is putting too much out on an album. Quite often not the best songs that he recorded in the sessions, but things like Egypt Station, I felt there were certain songs on there for me personally that just sort of dragged. Things like Caesar Rock, for example, is one that really sticks in my mind from that album. Even Who Cares, which was one of the singles. But just that sort of sense of when you get tired listening to an album. And obviously because I was in like a public place, I was in a record shop in Letchworth, David's Music, brilliant name for a shop. Which is like an independent record store. And it was very warm, and I managed to pinch a chair, but it was quite uncomfortable. But despite that, I didn't feel like the album was dragging. It didn't feel like it was too long. And I think that's a good thing. So whatever they've done, I'm sure there were more songs written in the sessions, but their choice of sort of keeping it quite tight, I would say, works very, very well. Another thing I thought was it feels very cohesive. Now, one of the things that a lot of the reviewers seem to be saying about this album, and there was one review in particular, I can't remember if it was The Guardian now, said, it sounds like him saying goodbye. And I've seen a few social media posts saying that as well on the back of a couple of his television appearances recently, and obviously the Days We Left Behind single. I really didn't feel that at all. One thing that I really noticed was the energy of it was there. There were a lot more up-tempo songs than perhaps I was expecting. There were lots of sort of layered harmonies and interesting arrangement things going on. You've got all the usual things like loops and the sort of usual instrumentation, but even like some of the stuff, like, for example, on the song Life Can Be Hard, which has a bit of a sort of an orchestral accompaniment, a bit of a sort of swing band feel. There's also the same on one of the songs, Salesman Saint, towards the end. And you've got things like recorders and various other things that he likes to lean on. But yeah, it was very, very sort of energized and creative. And while a few of the songs do look back on the early days as it's been sort of pitched, not that many, I would say. And also it just, like I say, it didn't feel like, for example, Johnny Cash singing Hurt, where you're like, yeah, he's saying goodbye. It didn't feel like the end of the end, which is ridiculously many years ago now, something like 2007. It didn't feel like a goodbye to me at all. If anything, it just reminded me of how much energy the man still has. And I think more of that as well is just to do with his age. Inevitably, with each of these albums, you always have that slight sense, or certainly I do, of, well, is this going to be the last one? Because, time is catching up with us. But certainly he doesn't sound like he's trying to record his own swan song. He's just energized doing the thing he's doing, obviously enjoying working with the producer. And as ever, it's very interesting, his results. And it really did illustrate to me. I mean, the word that I haven't said yet, which I should say, is I thought the album was very good. I'd read the reviews, I was hopeful, but it is very good. It's very interesting. It sounds like bits of all of his recent albums. There were moments I wrote down where I go, okay, that sounds a bit like Hunt You Down off Egypt Station, for example, or that sounds like some of the stuff on McCartney 3. There was a definite sort of Fireman feel, Electric Arguments, a more structured version of that, but it had a lot of the things I like about what he's doing recently. And it's an interesting album. That's what I found, there was definite sense, while certain songs in it did read very, very quickly, and I liked, there's a sense that there's quite a lot of detail there, and it is something that is going to, I think, grow with time and with repeated listens. And it's not like when there's albums where you go, well, I don't think I'm going to listen to that again. It was an exciting listen, and it was pleasing as it always is, pleasing to hear him sound so energized, to hear new music from him. And yeah, it had that sort of feel. And as I say, it felt cohesive, I think, largely because the entire album is produced by one person, Andrew Watt. And whereas things like, for example, New, he used a variety of producers on that. McCartney 3 was mostly him, and Egypt Station was mostly one apart from, I think, one or two songs. But in the same way that, say, something like Chaos and Creation feels like one whole album and feels like a Nigel Godrich-McCartney sort of project, this has that same sort of sense of it's cohesive. It's not necessarily that the songs all follow the same theme. And as I say, the sort of looking back on his childhood, his pre-Beatles days, is how they've very much leaned heavily on the promotional aspect of the album. And there are definite, as I say, moments, a lot of moments of that in the album. But it's more that there is a sense of focus to the album and drive and energy, and it all feels very much like it's coming from the same person, even if the songs are quite different. Now, I'll try now and briefly go into a bit more detail about specifics of songs. I won't talk for too long because, as I say, this is only a sort of little bit of a dip in the toe into the album. But and also, as I say, it's hard to when you only listen to it just the once. But I would say early highlights for me listening on that first time, song-wise, one that really stood out was Mountaintop. Which was a sort of quite trippy song. It's about, sort of inspired by Glastonbury. I think it talks about magic mushrooms. It talks about tripping. It's got a very sort of late 60s vibe, but that was very cool. Life Can Be Hard is the song that I've come out of that listen party with it in my head for the last 2 days. And I don't know if that's partly because we'd heard a clip of it before on that documentary McCartney 321 recently, where he's playing on the piano, and that's been pushed a bit on social media. But no, that is the one with probably the most memorable melody, the most interesting melody, and yeah, that's really stuck in my head. Other obvious highlights, I would say, are the two singles, Days We Left Behind and Home to Us. Days We Left Behind is the better song of the two, I'd say, and when that kicks in, track 3 of the album, it's the first sort of ballad on the album, but yeah, it just really hits home. And Home to Us, while it's a bit more fun, I saw one reviewer, I think it was The Guardian, describe it as being a bit like She's Electric, the Oasis song, which made me laugh. I wouldn't go quite as far as that, but it's kind of throwaway, but it is fun and it's a good song. Other songs that stood out, Down South, which is track 6 on the album, which is a kind of early days look at the early time with George Harrison, when they used to go around hitchhiking when they went to Wales and stuff, and that was a really lovely one as well. Another couple of songs that stood out were First Star of the Night and Salesman Saint. Salesman Saint had been briefly sort of previewed on the Rest is History podcast when he was chatting on that to Tom Holland. Not that Tom Holland, but that one, the one over there. And then that didn't really sort of stand out to me, but yeah, hearing it in the context of the album was nice, and there's a really clever pull against the rhythm of the song at the end with the swing band that they throw in, because it's referencing Paul's parents, Jim and Mary, and what their backgrounds were. Mary is the, he said undertaker then, ridiculous, midwife, the opposite. And Jim, obviously, I think he was a cotton salesman, wasn't he? But being in a swing band. But that's really, really clever. Like I say as well, there are sort of shades of lots of McCartney's work in there, as you'd expect. There were moments with backing vocals that reminded me of Once Upon a Long Ago, which was in the song Never Know. And then there were moments, as I say, that sounded like McCartney 3, that sounded like Egypt Station, that sounded like The Fireman. And also his voice, the inevitable question of his voice. It sounds like what you'd expect it to sound like. That's what I'd say. It never sounds bad. It just sounds like McCartney now, which is what you'd expect. And I think that gives a lot of the songs extra charm. So things like The Days We Left Behind, some of the charm is the sound of the voice and the sound of him looking back on it. Down South, this sort of acoustic early days style song about his relationship with George. Also sounds a bit like Confidant, actually. But the fact that it's just essentially, initially at least, a straightforward performance of him with acoustics singing about his time with George gives it that sort of charm. And and Clary and I have talked about this a lot, the thing that shows up his voice a lot more now, for the negative, is when you see him doing some of the Beatles and Wings classics on tour, or particularly when he's doing television appearances. For example, very recently, the Saturday Night Live one, which he got a lot of stick for, that sort of shows it up, because inevitably asking a man in his 80s to sound like a man in his 30s or 20s is not something, is an over ask. But what is quite nice, actually, as an aside, seeing people's feedback in response to things like that, and the Saturday Night Live, you had one contingent saying, oh my God, he sounds like an old man, because they don't understand that he's older. But then a lot of people were standing up for him as well, and just, I think people are being a lot more sort of generous to Paul now because they appreciate him for who he is and what he does. And that's been something that has changed back and forth over the years. You know, like with any artist, you go between being sort of lauded and being seen with disdain. And I think as Paul ages and kind of leans into that stuff more, people are a lot more like, well, I'm just glad that we can still see him. And also, I mean, his voice is so up and down because while when he did Band on the Run, for example, on Saturday Night Live, and I'm going to go too much into this now, I'll talk about this with Clary when we get the proper chance. But then conversely, when he was on the Stephen Colbert show, singing Hello Goodbye of all songs, which is actually probably a more difficult ask, he sounded great. Or sounded like, you know, him now, but hitting the notes. So who knows? But yeah, the voice sounds good. It's well produced. It's produced cleverly to use his limitations to its advantage. There are no really cringy vocal moments. I would say probably the most exposing of the songs on the album vocally is Life Can Be Hard, because it's much more in the upper register. But the way he sings it, sort of a bit more falsetto, a bit more sort of broken, but he's hitting the notes well. So that's probably the only song where I listened to it and went, oh, this would be really interesting to hear with his voice, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But I didn't go, oh, no, this is awkward. Whereas, for example, on McCartney 3, one of my favourite songs on that was The Kiss of Venus, but I thought the vocal wasn't very good on that and was very exposed, and I feel like it could have been a different take on a different day might have made it sound better. But yeah, there was no moments like that. I'm going to probably stop there because I don't want to talk for ages. And obviously, as I say, I've only heard the album once, and I look forward to hearing it more, and I look forward to sort of sinking my teeth into it better and then talking to Clary about it as well. But, I mean, one thing I would say is that it's not by any means a disappointment. It's an exciting album. It's a very creative album. It's an interesting album. And it just shows that he really is in a purple period, which has come and been the case at least since Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. How does it stand up compared to that? That is a very high benchmark, that album. But one of the things people said about that album was that they maybe felt it was a bit too downbeat. And again, maybe it was just a tiny bit too long. It's hard to say, really, how this will stand in time. But it does feel cohesive. There is so much invention going on, so many different time signatures and things going on, lots of lovely harmonies going on. If I was to list any negatives, I mean, one thing I would say is that there were quite a lot of songs that are quite sort of chuggy, which is, again, feeds into that feeling of like written in the studio. But as I say, most of the things are quite interesting around it. Another negative, as I say, is that maybe a lot of it feels like it's written in the studio, but I do think they've kind of steered that well. And just a couple of little bugbears. There was like a lead sound on, a lead guitar sound, that is, on the first track, As You Lie There, which is a bit sort of fuzzy middle of the road. And I thought, I'm not really sure about this sound. That one also features a quite interesting spoken word portion with Paul, which I don't know what I feel about yet until I hear it a few times. But even that underlined that there's a lot of invention going on here. There's a lot of different ideas being played with. It's just someone churning it out. And again, for a man who has written so many songs and turns 84 next month, it is pretty ridiculous how creative and inventive he still is. And there's so much life in this album, and that's always great to see. So yeah, those are my first thoughts. I'd be interested, and we would be interested in your first thoughts when you finally get to listen to the album, or maybe you went to a listening party too. Do tell us, do drop us a line. You can contact us at paulmccartneyabc@gmail.com, and you can find us on X, Facebook, Instagram and Threads under the handle McCartney ABC. And also, if you like this podcast, if you like what Clary and I do, like it, review it, subscribe, tell your friends, because that's how we spread the word around. Anyway, I shall leave you now to your own devices. Clary will be back soon, so it's less like some weird sprawling monologue. But yeah, it's good times. There's a new Macca album coming out very soon. That's always a thing to be excited about. We've got lots of exciting new episodes planned coming your way. But for now, we're just going to leave you to settle into the new album, and we'll be back with you very, very soon. Thank you for listening. The McCartney McAlphabet is written and edited by David F. Gray and Clary Sadler, and is inspired by and features selections from the music of Paul McCartney.